Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. We're going straight to Kyiv, where Moscow is trying to convert a threat of strikes into a diplomatic pressure campaign. The big update is that Russia is now telling foreign governments, diplomats, and international organizations to get out of the Ukrainian capital because it says systematic strikes are coming against defense industrial facilities, drone production sites, command posts, and decision-making centers. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov personally carried that message to U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, urging Washington to evacuate embassy personnel. That is not just military signaling. That is Moscow trying to make the political environment around Kyiv look unstable and unsafe. Ukraine and the EU are pushing back hard. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha called the warning Russian blackmail, and EU Ambassador Katerina Mathernova said the EU mission is staying in Kyiv. That response matters. Russia is trying to make embassies behave like the capital is radioactive. Kyiv's partners are saying, essentially, no thanks. We have seen the Kremlin's drama series before, and Season 5 is not suddenly prestige television. The strategic point is simple. Moscow wants diplomatic isolation around Ukraine without having to win it on the battlefield. This is also an update on the Starobilsk story. Russia says Ukraine struck a college dormitory in occupied Luhansk and killed 21 people. Ukraine denies targeting civilians and says the target was Russia's Rubicon Center for Advanced Unmanned Technologies, a military drone unit. The site is in Russian-occupied territory, so independent verification remains limited. Moscow is using the incident as the moral wrapping paper for its Kyiv threat, but the timing is doing a lot of work here. Russian strikes on Kyiv had already intensified after the brief Victory Day ceasefire ended earlier this month. So the Starobilsk claim may be part of the story, but it is also being used as a megaphone. The domestic angle inside Russia is getting harder for the Kremlin to hide. Putin's wartime bargain with the public has always been pretty straightforward. The state handles the war, and ordinary Russians keep some version of normal life. That bargain is fraying. Ukrainian drones are reaching Russian cities and energy sites. Mobile internet shutdowns are disrupting daily commerce. Inflation, taxes, and slower growth are becoming more visible. Even in an authoritarian system, people notice when the apps stop working, the grocery bill climbs, and the war that was supposed to stay over there starts wandering into the neighborhood like an unwanted guest at a family barbecue. The Kremlin appears to understand that pressure because it is now sweetening the recruitment package. Putin signed a decree offering debt relief of up to 10 million rubles for new war recruits and their spouses. That is a serious incentive. It also quietly says the manpower problem is not going away. If the war effort were humming along comfortably, Moscow would not need to keep stacking financial carrots this high. There's a very practical message here. Russia still has bodies, but getting enough of them into uniform at acceptable political cost requires ever more creative accounting. Moscow is also giving itself wider legal room to maneuver. Putin enacted a law allowing the use of Russian forces overseas to defend Russian citizens, facing prosecution in foreign or international courts. That language is broad, vague, and extremely convenient. It gives the Kremlin a future pretext it can pull off the shelf when needed. Russia has a long history of dressing coercion in protective language, going back through the Soviet toolkit and well into the modern, we are only defending our people routine. Different packaging, familiar product. The money picture is just as important. Russia is preparing to sell a 20% state stake in Novorossiysk commercial seaport, a major export node tied to crude flows. The federal budget deficit has already exceeded the full-year target by more than 50%. That is a big red warning light on the dashboard. Moscow can still fund the war, but it is increasingly reaching for assets, incentives, and workarounds. The Kremlin wants to project endless capacity, but the balance sheet is starting to whisper, then cough, then bang a spoon on the table. Ukraine is trying to make that balance sheet worse. Kyiv's strike campaign is increasingly aimed at Russia's war support infrastructure, energy, logistics, air defense, and rear area military nodes. The The newer reporting points to attacks on the Belets oil depot in Bryansk Oblast and military infrastructure in occupied Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Crimea. The most important part is not the full target list. It is the pattern. Ukraine is trying to make Russia defend more places, move equipment farther from the front, burn money on protection, and operate under constant uncertainty. That is how a smaller force creates strategic leverage against a larger one. On the front line, the fighting is still active, but this is not the main strategic story today. Russian forces are pressing with infiltration tactics in places like northern Kharkiv, Kostiantynivka, Huliaipol, and Oleksandrivka, while relying heavily on drones and glide bombs. Around Kharkiv, Russian fiber optic drones reportedly have expanded reach, which increases pressure on the city's northern and eastern areas. But the bigger picture remains uneven for Moscow. Russian forces are grinding, not racing. Ukrainian drones and mid-range strikes continue to raise the cost of every push. This is less blitzkrieg and more very expensive mud wrestling, with artillery, accountants, and propaganda officers all screaming at once. Now to NATO's neighborhood, where Russia is making itself everyone's least favorite neighbor with a radio tower. Lithuania's communications regulator says Russia has expanded GPS spoofing infrastructure in Kaliningrad from 3 antennae in early 2025 to 36 now. That could push interference deep into Europe, affecting the Baltics, Poland, parts of Finland and Sweden, and the Baltic Sea. This is classic gray zone behavior: disruptive, deniable, and just annoying enough to create real risk without triggering a clean response. Think geopolitical robocalls, but instead of trying to sell you a car warranty, they are messing with navigation systems. The maritime space is getting murkier too. Russian authorities said divers found magnetic mines on the Liberia-flagged tanker Arrhenius after it arrived from Antwerp to load liquefied petroleum gas at Ust-Luga. Moscow claimed the devices were made in a NATO country. NATO denied mining any tanker. The facts are contested, but the narrative is useful for the Kremlin. It lets Russia argue that Western-linked sabotage is targeting its energy infrastructure, which can justify more security controls at ports and feed the domestic siege narrative. It is very Moscow: fog first, accusations second, evidence somewhere in the back room with the lights off. Russia is also using regional intelligence forums to pull the Ukraine war into a wider internal security frame. FSB Director Alexander Bortnikov claimed Russian and Uzbek services stopped 5 terrorist attacks in Russia, including Moscow, and that Russian and Tajik services neutralized a terrorist cell earlier this year. He accused Ukrainian services of moving saboteurs through neighboring states, recruiting mercenaries, exploiting labor migrants, and running online influence operations. These are Russian state claims, so handle with care. But the messaging is the important part. Moscow wants CIS governments to treat Ukraine and the West as a shared internal security threat. Belarus remains a pressure point. Exiled opposition leader Svietlana Tsikhanouskaya made her first working visit to Kyiv and met Sybiha, arguing that only a democratic Belarus can bring real stability to the region. Ukraine is reinforcing its northern defenses because it worries Russia could try to pull Belarus deeper into the war. Alexander Lukashenko still says Belarus will not enter directly, but Minsk remains Moscow's closest partner, has hosted Russian drone activity, and recently held nuclear-related drills with Russia. Belarus is trying to look like the calm guy at the party while standing next to the speaker, the smoke machine, and the person juggling fireworks. Finally, the war in Ukraine is increasingly connected to the wider global defense market. Ukraine's drone, sensor, and air defense innovations are becoming attractive to Gulf states, and Kyiv has signed security agreements with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Russia, meanwhile, is trying to preserve its defense export reputation through talks with India over additional S-400 air defense systems. But delayed deliveries from the original 2018 deal show the problem. Moscow still wants to be treated like a premier arms supplier, while the war in Ukraine keeps revealing just how strained that industrial machine has become. Thanks for listening and for being part of this community. If you want to support the show, leaving a review or a thoughtful comment helps others discover it. We also share a daily written intel brief on Substack, restrictedhandling.substack.com, where we go deeper on Russia and China, along with broader coverage of Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Wishing you a great day ahead.